I wasn't ready. I repeated it to myself as I stood still in front of the door to courtroom 4B, my fingers trembling around a letter Benjamin had written me the night before. Behind that thick wooden door, I could hear voices. Voices arguing over my future, over his future, over our entire life, as if we were nothing more than a simple case file. My legs didn't want to move, but I knew that the moment that door opened, my son would have to choose between the woman who gave him life and the woman who gave him everything else. 17 years earlier, I never would have imagined that day would arrive. I had only followed a sound that changed me forever. It was a freezing cold night in January in Hyde Park, Chicago. The winter dampness clung to the old brick walls, as if memory itself refused to be erased. I had just finished grading a pile of my students' essays. I was walking down the hallway of my apartment building when a detail caught my attention. It was too silent for a Thursday, and then I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, a broken sob, a muffled cry swallowed between shaky breaths. I followed the sound without thinking. It led me to the corner next to the emergency stairwell. There, in the gloom, was a worn wicker basket. It wasn't a car seat or a diaper bag, just a common basket wrapped in an old coat with the edges damp from the frost. My heart began to pound, hard, faster than my mind could comprehend. I crouched down slowly, and then I saw him. He was tiny, barely a few days old. He was wrapped in a hospital blanket, his cheeks reddened and wet with tears. His lips were moving, but no sound came out, only air, desperation, the last effort of someone too fragile to cry anymore. Someone had left him there, hoping someone would find him, hoping he wouldn't die alone. To one side, awkwardly folded, there was a piece of paper. I can still see that trembling, hastily written script, just 5 words, "Please take care of him." My hands frozen. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911, but while I waited, I felt an uncontrollable impulse. I scooped him into my arms, held him tight against my chest, and embraced him as if that contact was the only thing capable of keeping him alive. His warmth mingled with my own trembling. I didn't know it then, but I was already making space for him in my heart. The ambulance arrived minutes later, though to me they felt like hours suspended in eternity. The paramedics checked him quickly, but I didn't let go of his tiny hand until they asked me to. I rode with them to the hospital, and as I watched the city lights blur through the window, I understood that my life had changed forever. That dark hallway in Hyde Park had been an ending for someone, and at the same time, the beginning of everything for me. At the hospital, everything became a whirlwind of voices and quick movements. Doctors and nurses professionally checked his temperature, his weight, his breathing. I could only watch him from the corner, my heart squeezed tight with the feeling that if I moved too far away, I would lose him. Hours passed, and with them came the news I hadn't expected. No one claimed him. There were no reports of missing newborns, no alerts to the authorities, no call from a regretful mother. The baby was a mystery. The nurses began calling him Baby January, a provisional name, useful for records, cold like the calendar. But inside me, another word had already begun to form, a name I wanted to pronounce with certainty. The next day, a social worker approached me, a clipboard in her hand. She explained that the state would designate a temporary guardian and that in the meantime, the little one would be in custody. I listened to her talk, but my lips moved ahead of my reason. I want to keep him. I want to adopt him. She looked at me surprised and took a seat in front of me, beginning to list an endless array of requirements. Financial stability, owning a home, marital status, psychological evaluations. I nodded to everything, though I knew I met almost none of it. I wasn't married. I lived in a tiny apartment above an antique bookstore and barely had any savings. But the only thing I felt compelled to say was, "What I have is enough, and I want to give him my entire life." I remember that woman, Rebecca Dunn, sighing as if she were accustomed to hearing promises that time later dismantles. Still, she handed me a stack of papers that I filled out with a steady hand. My answers were simple, but every stroke carried the conviction that I could no longer let him go. That very afternoon, while caressing his tiny fingers, I decided on the name that would accompany him, Benjamin, a gift from God. That's how it felt. The name left my lips with a tenderness that moved me, as if it had been written for him all along. The process wasn't immediate. Full weeks of home visits, interviews, medical reviews, and paperwork. They asked me if I was ready to give up my life for a child. I wanted to answer with another question: what life do you think I was living before him? But I limited myself to smiling and repeating the only thing I knew for sure: I'm ready. Finally, in March, they allowed me to bring him home. That first night, he didn't cry. He simply opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling, as if searching for a voice that would never arrive. I rocked him until dawn, telling him made-up stories about stars and second chances. I was 31 years old, he was barely 3 weeks old, and somehow we saved each other. The first few months were a constant challenge. My one-bedroom apartment became a refuge. The walls were thin and the windows let in icy drafts in winter. Even so, the space filled up with laughter, lullabies, and the scent of hot cocoa. On the most exhausted nights, I sold my father Frank's old guitar to buy him a decent crib. I took extra tutoring jobs after my classes. I clipped supermarket coupons and learned to stretch every dollar as if it were my last. No family member offered to help. Many asked me why a single woman without a husband or experience would want to take on an abandoned child. But they hadn't heard that cry in the darkness. They hadn't felt what I felt when I held him for the first time. Benjamin became my reason to wake up every morning, the certainty that filled the voids I didn't even know I had. The following years were a mix of scarcity and magic. My apartment above the old bookstore never stopped being modest. The walls had cracks, the winter crept in through the windows, and more than once I had to heat soup in a pot too small to stretch for the two of us. But within those walls, we invented our own universe. Since we didn't have a fireplace, Benjamin drew one on cardboard and leaned it against the wall. He would sit in front of it with his toys, as if the painted fire could give him warmth. I watched him and thought that perhaps true wealth wasn't in what was missing, but in the creativity that sprang forth to fill the void. When other kids talked about beach vacations, Benjamin and I went to the library. There he would pick out postcards of different cities, and at home we would pin them to an old map I hung in the living room. Someday we'll go to all these places, I would tell him, though deep down I knew that, at least for a while, we couldn't. But my son's bright eyes didn't care. For him, dreaming was enough. Over the years, we invented a secret tradition. Every January 12th, the day I found him in that hallway, we would turn off the lights and light a single candle. I would tell him the story of how a cry in the shadows had changed my life. And when I finished, I would always whisper the same phrase: "Today was the day I met you." He would listen in silence, with that absolute attention only children have when they feel someone is speaking from the heart. One particular memory remains the most powerful. Benjamin had just learned to walk. We were playing on the worn living room rug with a handful of wooden blocks. His hands were still sticky with jelly because he'd rushed through breakfast. I was trying to build a tower, and he laughed every time it fell down. Then, suddenly, he looked up at me, touched my face with those stained fingers, and said naturally, as if he had always known it, "Mama." I don't think he understood the gravity of what he was saying, but for me, it was as if the world had stopped. I got up, walked to the bathroom, closed the door, and covered my mouth with a towel so he wouldn't hear me crying. It wasn't sadness, it was the release of someone who for the first time in her life had been chosen unconditionally. From then on, every laugh, every stumble, and every embrace embroidered a relationship between us that didn't rely on blood, but on the constancy of being there. I gave him my sleepless nights, my hurried mornings, my always empty pockets, but my always full heart. He gave me something I never thought I would have, the certainty of being a mother. I always knew the time would come to tell him the truth, not because he asked, but because I owed it to him. When he turned 8 years old, it seemed unfair to continue hiding the origin of his life as if it were a shameful secret. He deserved the opposite. He deserved to know that from the very first moment, he had been loved. It was a cool afternoon in Hyde Park, the sky half cloudy and the air heavy with the smell of fresh street tacos and city steam coming from the nearby stands. We walked to the park 2 blocks from our building, where Benjamin liked to feed the ducks that gathered under the bridge. We sat on an iron bench, my hands sweaty and my throat tight. I watched him for a moment. His face already showed defined features, a curious gaze, a quick smile, the way he leaned forward when he wanted to listen intently. And then I said it, in a soft voice without embellishment. "Benjamin, there's something I want you to know. You weren't born with me. You were left at my door in a basket. There was no one there who could care for you, and in that instant, you became my world." He didn't answer right away. He picked up a stone from the ground and threw it into the water, watching the ripples open in circles. My heart was pounding so hard, I feared he could hear it. Finally, he turned to me, extended his small hand, and squeezed mine firmly. "I still choose you," he said. I don't recall ever feeling such an intense mix of relief and love. Tears suddenly streamed down, not of sadness, but of gratitude. I hugged him tight, and in that embrace, I realized that blood might tell a story, but the choice to stay in love writes an entire book. That day, I returned home with a weight off my shoulders. The truth was no longer an invisible wall between us. There was trust, there was transparency, and most importantly, there was an 8-year-old boy who had given me the answer I needed for the rest of my life. As time passed, that sincerity became the foundation for everything that would come. Benjamin began to grow with a different maturity, with a sensitivity that was reflected in the way he looked at the world. He spent hours drawing in his sketchbooks, sometimes scenes from the street, other times fantastic creatures that seemed to be born from dreams. I watched him from the kitchen table while grading exams and noticed that his silence wasn't distance, but an inner refuge where his imagination flourished. The boy who once drew a cardboard fireplace now began to capture human faces with crayons, seeking something in every stroke, as if he wanted to understand beyond what he saw. I understood that his art would be the path by which he would learn to answer questions that neither I nor anyone else could answer. And so, as childhood transformed into early adolescence, his world filled with colors and forms that took him a little farther from me, but also showed me that he was growing his own wings. Between the ages of 10 and 15, Benjamin found his own refuge in the highest corner of our building, the attic. It was a cramped space with creaking wooden beams and dust accumulated in old boxes. But for him, it became a secret studio. Whenever he disappeared from the living room or his bedroom, I knew I would find him there, surrounded by crumpled paper, worn charcoal sticks, and paint stains that looked like scars from his inner world. At first, he filled his notebooks with dragons and castles, fantastic creatures born from the stories I told him when he was little. But little by little, his strokes began to change. The monsters gave way to faces, human faces of people he saw on the street, bus passengers, neighbors he barely greeted at the local market. There was a seriousness in those drawings that did not correspond to his age, a silent sadness that made me wonder where he got it from. One afternoon, I went up to the attic without him hearing me. I saw him concentrating, his brow furrowed, drawing the profile of an older woman. When he finished, he set it aside without looking at it, as if it didn't matter to him. I, on the other hand, froze. The expression of that woman was so real, so melancholy, that she seemed about to speak. It was in that instant that I understood that art was not just a hobby for him, but a language of his own. That same year, the school held an art competition. I remember he hesitated to participate because he didn't like competition, but in the end, he submitted an illustration that took my breath away. An enormous dragon, not like the ones he invented as a child, but one reading a story to a small, frightened knight. The image was so powerful that he won first place. I watched him walk onto the stage with the paper in his hand, shy but proud, and I clapped until my hands hurt. I saved that drawing and taped it to the inside of my closet, where it still remains. In time, his ambitions began to take shape. One night, while we were eating microwaved leftovers, he looked at me with a mixture of nerves and determination. "Mama, I want to go to an art school in Portland, Oregon. They say the city is full of colors and people who breathe creativity. I feel like I could really grow there." I smiled, stroked his cheek, and told him he was already a canvas in motion, a painting still being created. But inside me, I felt that silent pang that only a mother knows, the love that means letting go, the fear that dreams might take him too far from me. I supported him. Of course, we'll find a way. I promised him that somehow we would do everything possible to get him there. But from that day on, I noticed something different in our relationship. His gaze no longer anchored itself to mine for so long. His silence was no longer the calm of a child playing beside me, but the introspection of a young man who was beginning to keep secrets within. They weren't secrets against me, I knew, but the start of an independence that was slowly pushing its way through. And while I tried to accept that natural distance, I didn't imagine that another kind of distance would soon arrive, one that had nothing to do with adolescence, but with the past, which had always been waiting behind a closed door. The first sign that something had changed came one morning in January. When I went down to the kitchen, I found a note on the table written in Benjamin's unmistakable handwriting. The paper was crumpled at the corners, as if he had hesitated many times before leaving it there. I opened it with trembling hands and read, "I love you. Please don't hate me for wanting to know where I come from." I felt a knot in my stomach. I had always told him that the door to his past was his to open, but I never imagined he would open it without me. I put the note in my robe pocket and spent the rest of the day with a sense of emptiness that no class or task could fill. The answer came faster than I expected. One afternoon, returning from school with my arms loaded with grocery bags, I saw a black car parked in front of the building. Its tinted windows reflected the gray sky, and the engine was still running. I thought it might be a visitor for the landlord, but then the door opened and a woman stepped out. She was tall, immaculate, with reddish hair pulled back into a perfect bun and a red coat cinched at the waist. She walked as if the whole world belonged to her. When her eyes fell on me, she smiled with a calm that chilled my blood. She introduced herself without extending her hand, as if she didn't need to. "I'm Margaret Holloway. I believe you've been raising my son." The bags almost dropped from my hands. I didn't know what to say. I barely mumbled my name and went inside the building, but she followed me into my apartment kitchen as if she had a right to be there. We sat face to face. The formica table between us became an invisible battleground. She placed a black folder with gold letters on the corner of the surface, a law firm. Her voice was soft, but every word had an edge. "First, I want to thank you for what you've done. I know it wasn't easy raising him alone, but the time has come for him to reconnect with what is his blood, his history, his family." I felt the air grow heavy. I managed to ask in a low voice, "Where were you 17 years ago?" She didn't blink. "I was 18. I was an addict. I was on the street and I was scared. Leaving him was my way of saving his life. Now I'm well. I want a second chance." My hands clenched on the table. You didn't leave a phone number or a name, just a note asking someone to clean up the mess." She leaned forward slightly, her elbows barely grazing the wood. "And you did. You did it wonderfully, but he's still mine." I shook my head. "No, no, he's not. Not anymore." Then she played her final card. She pulled a sheet from the folder and slid it toward me. It was a DNA test. The match was positive. I didn't need to read the whole thing. The way she said "mine" had already confirmed it. Before leaving, she delivered the final blow. "Benjamin contacted me weeks ago. He was afraid of hurting you. That's why he didn't tell you. But I've already spoken with him. It's only a matter of time." When the door closed behind her, I went to Benjamin's room. The space was empty, but the air still held his essence. The smell of paint, damp wood, the shampoo he always left uncapped. On the bed, I found one of his sketchbooks. On the last page, there were two women made of mirror fragments, one with sharp lines, the other blurred and unfinished. In the corner, a single word: divide. I didn't cry that night. I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of mother I would continue to be after this. The following days became a strange routine, as if I were living in a house with transparent walls. Benjamin was still with me, but his mind was already moving elsewhere. He told me that Margaret had invited him to the coast, to the same ocean where she had spent part of her youth. He would come home with sun-reddened skin and a photograph in his hand, her younger, sitting in the sand with a guitar. "I have her nose," he murmured, more to himself than to me. I only smiled. What I wanted to tell him was, "No, Benjamin, you have your own. You have the life we built here." I didn't stop him. I didn't forbid anything. I watched him leave again and again with his backpack over his shoulder, with a new brightness in his eyes, that gleam born from the curiosity for what one believes was lost. Meanwhile, I pretended to be normal. I cleaned the kitchen more than necessary, arranged the books in alphabetical order, and cooked dishes that remained untouched. The silence between us was no longer complicit, but cautious. One day, Margaret extended an invitation to both of us. It was dinner at a downtown restaurant, a place with immaculate tablecloths and sparkling glasses. I hesitated to accept, but Benjamin asked me with that mix of plea and hope that disarms me. So I put on the blue dress he himself had given me for Christmas, and we walked in hand in hand. Margaret was already there, with her red coat like a flag, her glass raised, and that measured smile that didn't reach her eyes. The table was set, and for a moment I believed everything could be cordial. We talked about his scholarship, his college plans, his talent that grew with every stroke. But beneath every word pulsed the question neither of us dared to pronounce: "To whom do you belong?" Benjamin felt it. I saw it in his expression when he looked away from his plate and gazed at both of us as if trying to decipher a language written in two different dialects. Suddenly, he put down his silverware and said in a clear, though shaky voice, "I don't want to lose either of you, but if I have to choose, I choose the one who stayed." Time stopped. My breath broke. Margaret looked down at her glass and didn't respond. I didn't say anything either, because words would have ruined that instant. All I could do was squeeze my son's hand under the table, grateful and broken at the same time. That night, we returned in silence. Benjamin locked himself in his room, and I stayed seated in the living room with the lights off, trying to imprint that sentence on my memory forever. But the calm didn't last long. Weeks later, a manila envelope arrived in my mailbox. I opened it and felt the floor disappear beneath my feet. It was a judicial notification. Margaret had filed a petition for custody review, with lawyers, with evidence, with all the power that paperwork could offer. I knew the real battle was just beginning. The day of the trial dawned wrapped in a thick fog, as if the city itself wanted to hide from what was about to happen. I put on a navy blue blouse and the pearl earrings I had inherited from my mother, Dorothy. I don't know why. Perhaps because I needed to remember that I came from a line of women who, with their light and shadow, had always resisted. When I entered the courtroom, Margaret was already there. She wasn't alone. She was accompanied by two impeccable lawyers with expensive suits and the practiced smile of those who know how to erase 17 years with a couple of well-rehearsed phrases. I sat on the other side with a folder full of photographs, report cards, receipts, and Benjamin's drawings. No lawyer backed me up, only everything I had lived with him. The judge, a woman with gray hair and a tired gaze, opened the file and began to read. She spoke of the minor, the biological mother, the legal guardian. Nobody mentioned the word mother. That word floated in the air, absent, as if it didn't exist. Margaret's lawyers were the first to speak. They painted a neat story of redemption, the history of a young woman who had made mistakes, who had fallen into addiction and despair, but who, with effort and treatment, had rebuilt her life. A woman who, they argued, deserved to reclaim her place. They said Benjamin had a right to his blood, his heritage, his cultural legacy. One even insinuated that staying with me could limit his opportunities. For a moment, I was tempted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because the irony hit me full force. How could they measure 17 years of sleepless nights against abstract promises of the future? Then my turn came. I stood up with steady hands and faced those gazes that wanted to reduce me to a footnote. "I'm not here to discuss biology," I said. "I'm not here to deny her recovery. I'm here because 17 years ago, I found a baby in a dark hallway. He didn't have a name or a plan, just a note that said, 'Please take care of him.' And I did." I felt the silence stretch as my voice continued. I spoke of his first wobbly steps on the worn rug, of his fear of thunderstorms, of his obsession with colorful candy and dinosaurs. I told them about the measles at age 5, the broken arm at 10, the math test that made him cry when he was 13. But I didn't stop at the list of anecdotes. I wanted to show them the essence of what it means to be a mother. I told him stories when he couldn't sleep. I let him hate me when he was angry. I forgave him before he knew how to ask for forgiveness. I taught him how to tie a tie, how to fail with dignity, how to say, "I'm scared," without shame. I didn't give him life, but I gave him his childhood. Isn't that what being a mother is? The entire courtroom was still. Even the judge, Judge Patricia Caldwell, stopped writing for a moment and looked directly at me, as if my words had cut through the coldness of the papers. No one responded. There were no legal arguments against what was invisible yet evident: the years, the dedication, the presence. The judge didn't give an immediate verdict. She said she needed time, that the case was complex, that she needed to consider what was best for the minor. But I knew that beyond the laws, something had broken in that room, the illusion that motherhood could be summarized by a blood test. When we left the courthouse, the fog was beginning to dissipate. The air smelled of rain, and I stood on the steps trying to breathe calmly. Then I felt him. Benjamin approached, looked me in the eyes with a seriousness I had rarely seen in him, and uttered the words I still keep like an amulet. "I don't want to lose either of you, Mama, but if I have to choose, I choose the one who stayed." And in that instant, the fear that had accompanied me for months cracked. It didn't disappear completely, but it let in the first light. The resolution arrived weeks later. The judge ruled that I would remain the primary legal guardian. Margaret would be entitled to scheduled visits, supervised meetings, occasional calls. It wasn't a total victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. In reality, the decision that mattered had already been made, outside that room, in my son's heart, because it was Benjamin who, without anyone pressuring him, chose to stay with me. "My life is here, Mama," he told me one night as we put away his sketchbooks. "And if I go to another city, I want it to be for my dreams, not because someone is taking me away." Soon after, the acceptance letter arrived. The art school in Portland had admitted him with a full scholarship. I remember the moment he showed it to me. We were in the kitchen, the floor still wet because I had just mopped. He came in, drenched from the rain, handed me the envelope, and as I read the printed words, I felt my knees buckle. I dropped into a chair and cried so hard I could barely breathe. He sat with me on the floor, just like when he was a child, and rested his head under my chin until the tears dried dry. The following days were filled with preparations, suitcases open on the bed, endless lists of supplies, paints, brushes, winter clothes. I found myself folding shirts and, at the same time, silently storing memories. The sound of his footsteps coming down the stairs, the smell of charcoal on his fingers, the made-up stories at midnight. The morning of the farewell came too soon. His room was almost empty. The bare walls left pale shadows where his drawings had once hung. The half-dead bookshelf looked like a skeleton. I stood in the doorway looking at that space that had been his world. I didn't cry. I smiled, because I understood that this emptiness was not loss, but transformation. When we went downstairs with the bags, I hugged him for a long time, longer than he expected. I felt his shoulders, now those of a young adult, embrace me back. "I love you, Mama," he whispered. "I love you too, Benjamin." And I watched him walk away with his backpack on his back and his eyes fixed on the horizon. That day, I returned to the apartment alone. The silence was denser than ever, but in my chest there was no loneliness. There was pride. There was gratitude. Because this is also what motherhood is, holding on with all your strength and then letting go with love. I thought the story was complete, that the rest would be waiting for his calls and the letters he would send from college. But I didn't know that one last gift still awaited me, one that would arrive at the hands of the woman who had abandoned him one day and who years later had claimed her right to him. The first drawing Benjamin sent me from Portland arrived a week after he settled into the dorm. It was a simple pencil sketch of the skyline he saw from his window. I framed it and put it on my bedside table, as if that thin paper were an invisible cord still keeping us connected. In time, the letters became a habit. Once a week, an envelope arrived with a new creation. Sometimes it was the profile of a classmate, other times the view from a coffee shop where he studied. But there was one that took my breath away. That time, I opened the envelope and found a watercolor. Under a leafy tree, two women were drawn, one with reddish hair, the other with a tired expression but a warm smile. Beneath it, in firm handwriting, he had written, "I belong to the one who stayed." I stared at it for a long time, my hands trembling. I didn't cry immediately. I smiled first, because I understood that beyond the doubts, beyond the judgments and the wounds, my son had found his truth. A few years later, I received another call, this time not from Benjamin, but from the hospital. Margaret had fallen gravely ill. A ruined liver, they said, a consequence of a life that had begun with wounds too deep. Benjamin was by her side during her final days. He told me he held her hand, that he told her it was okay to rest, that he was at peace. And when her last breath faded, he called me. "Come get me, Mama," he said in a broken voice. I drove there and brought him back home in silence. Sometimes words aren't needed when the loss says everything. Weeks later, Benjamin arrived with a cardboard box wrapped in brown paper. He put it on the kitchen table and said, "This is from her. She wanted you to have it." Inside were photographs of Margaret in her youth, hospital bracelets, and even the original note she had left with me 17 years earlier. At the very bottom, carefully stored, I found a worn hardcover notebook. It was her journal. It took me weeks to read it. Every page was written in cramped handwriting, with scratch-outs, with ink stains. It spoke of addiction, of fear, of nights on the street, but also of dreams she could never fulfill. In several passages, she mentioned a baby she couldn't raise, and in one of them, written in large letters, she called me the unknown miracle. I closed the notebook with silent tears, understanding for the first time that although our paths had crossed out of desperation, she too had wished, deep down, that someone would love him as I had. Years passed. Benjamin became a professional illustrator. His work appeared in children's books, community murals, and workshops for children in foster care and group homes. Every weekend, he dedicated hours to teaching art to little ones who, like him once, carried the uncertainty of not knowing where they came from. "It makes me feel like I'm giving back some of what I received," he told me. I watched him work with those paint-stained hands and understood that he had transformed his history into colors capable of healing. Today, when someone asks me if I have children, I answer with pride. Yes, I have one son. He's an artist. He teaches. He loves deeply. No one questions me about DNA, about last names, about lawsuits. And even if they did, I wouldn't need to justify myself, because I understood that motherhood is not measured by shared blood, but by constant presence, by nights spent awake with fever, by hurried packed lunches, by advice given from the passenger seat of an old car. Motherhood is built in the invisible, in the sacrifices that no one applauds. I didn't need a shared surname to be his mother. I only needed to stay. And every day, even today, I continue to choose him. That is my legacy. That is our home. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.